There is a story Scotland never tells about itself. Not the one carved into stone crosses or sung in the great halls, not the one preserved in genealogies of noble lineage, or the cautious records of monks copying names onto vellum by firelight. There is another story, quieter, older, and far more honest about how power actually moved through a clan. It was never about the chiefs alone. It was never about the warriors or the cattle or the swords raised at border disputes. It was about the women who slept beside power, fed it, counseled it, bore its children, and absorbed its costs. Women who were not wives. Women who were not servants. Women who existed in a category that had no clean name, no legal definition, no hereditary protection, and yet without whom the entire architecture of clan authority would have been structurally incomplete. They were not whores. They were not slaves. They were not simple concubines in the way the Romans understood the word. They were something older than all of those categories. Something that the Gaelic-speaking world of ancient Scotland had quietly accommodated for generations without ever needing to explain. And the truth of their lives, the real texture of what it meant to inhabit that role, in a world of peat smoke and frozen ground, of cattle raids and shifting allegiances, of ritual obligation and bone-deep superstition, is one of the most revealing windows into how Highland society actually functioned beneath the surface of everything it publicly claimed to be. Understand this, and you will never look at the clan system the same way again. To understand what these women were, you first have to understand the world that made them necessary. Ancient Scotland was not a nation. It was not even a coherent political structure. It was a landscape, a severe, demanding, magnificently indifferent landscape that had organized human beings into survival clusters held together by blood, oath, and the shared memory of ancestors. The clan was not a family in the modern sense. It was a living machine designed to persist through generations of cold, scarcity, violence, and uncertainty. Picture the terrain, not the romanticized postcard version. The real version, treeless hillsides scraped raw by Atlantic wind, valley floors half submerged in peat bog for 6 months of the year, forests dense enough to lose cattle in, rivers that swelled without warning and swept away anything that crossed them carelessly. In the early centuries of the Highland clan system, before the later medieval consolidation of names and territories, this landscape imposed a fundamental truth on everyone living within it. You survived as a group, or you did not survive at all. The roundhouses and longhouses scattered across those hills were not romantic. They were dark, smoke-filled structures of timber, wattle, and turf, their interiors blackened by the central fires that never went out, because the cost of letting them die was sometimes a family's life. Animals were brought inside in winter, not out of sentiment, but because their body heat was part of the thermal equation. The smell was permanent. The dampness was permanent. The cold that pressed through the walls from October to April was something you learned to carry inside your body, like a second skeleton. Inside those walls, the extended family, the core kinship unit, functioned as both economic enterprise and social contract. Labor was not divided by preference. It was divided by survival logic. Women processed grain, managed dairy, produced the cloth that kept everyone alive in cold weather, tended the kitchen gardens that supplemented the diet during the narrow growing season. Men managed cattle, defended territory, fulfilled the martial obligations that allegiance to a chief demanded. Children were absorbed into this labor structure before they were old enough to fully understand it. Food was a constant negotiation with scarcity. Oats in their various forms, porridge, flatbread, rough cake, formed the nutritional backbone of ordinary life. Cattle provided milk, blood occasionally drawn for mixing with grain, and meat at the great seasonal slaughters, when animals that could not be fed through winter were killed and their flesh preserved in salt or fat. Wild game, fish from the lochs and rivers, foraged roots and herbs, these filled the margins. Hunger was not a catastrophe. It was a seasonal rhythm that everyone understood and managed as best they could. If this kind of story makes you see the past with greater depth, consider subscribing. These scripts take time to build, and there are still many stories waiting to be told. The authority that held all of this together sat at the top of the clan in the figure of the chief. And the chief's position was not simply inherited, it was performed continuously before the eyes of his people. A chief who could not feast his followers, could not defend their cattle, could not negotiate alliances that kept the peace with neighboring clans. That chief's authority was perpetually at risk. Prestige in this world was not abstract. It was calculated in animals given and received, in favors extended and repaid, in the quality of the men willing to stand beside you when a dispute turned dangerous, which is precisely where the women at the edge of his household enter the story. A chief's legitimate marriage was never a private matter. It was a geopolitical instrument. When the chief of one territory arranged a union with the daughter of another powerful family, he was not simply finding a companion, he was constructing a bridge. He was extending his network of obligation and reciprocal protection into a new territory. His wife came with her own kin behind her, her own loyalties, her own expectations about what that alliance required of him. She was, in the most fundamental sense, a diplomatic asset, wearing the face of a domestic arrangement. This meant that the chief's household was never purely his. His legitimate wife brought external pressures into its center. Her family would expect access. Her interests aligned with her birthkin as much as with her husband's clan. In the delicate choreography of Highland alliance politics, a chief with one powerful wife had effectively invited a second set of stakeholders into his most intimate decisions. And so, quietly, in the margins of the household, another arrangement existed. She did not arrive with ceremony. There was no feast marking her entrance into the chief's household, no exchange of cattle between families, no druid or later priest speaking words over the union to fix it in the memory of the community. She came the way most significant things in Highland life arrived, gradually, practically, without announcement, in a manner that everyone understood, without anyone needing to explain. The Gaelic legal tradition that shaped Highland social organization for centuries had a category for this arrangement. It was older than Christianity, older than the written records that would eventually try to contain it, older than the Church's persistent and largely unsuccessful attempts to impose a single model of legitimate union onto a world that had organized its intimate relationships according to entirely different logic. The arrangement recognized that a man of status, a chief, a tannist, a warrior of sufficient importance, might maintain more than one woman in a domestic role, and that the children produced by those unions carried specific, defined rights within the kinship structure. This was not secret. That is the first thing to understand about her life. The mistress of a clan chief in ancient Scotland was not a hidden figure. She was not a shameful presence confined to the margins of his existence. She was visible. Her role was understood. The household knew. The wider clan knew. In many cases, her own family had negotiated the arrangement directly with the chief, because having a daughter in that position was a form of alliance, making as real, if less formally powerful, as the alliance sealed by legitimate marriage. What was filthy about her life, if we are to use the word honestly, had nothing to do with the moral judgments that later centuries would layer onto her existence. The filth was literal. It was physical. It was the condition of every life in that world, elevated or ordinary, and it pressed against her in ways that her position did nothing to insulate her from. Consider the body in that world. Consider what it meant to maintain a human body in a highland settlement in the centuries before any of the mechanisms of modern hygiene had been imagined. Water was cold. Always cold. The nearest stream or spring might be a significant walk from the settlement, and the act of carrying sufficient water for bathing was itself a labor calculation that competed with every other labor demand of the day. Soap, in the form that would become familiar in later centuries, did not yet exist in these communities in any practical sense. Animal fat mixed with wood ash could serve as a rough cleaning agent, but its use required water, time, and privacy, none of which were abundant. Hair was managed rather than washed. It was combed with bone or antler combs, sometimes dressed with animal fat to control it, braided or bound to keep it functional. Parasites, lice specifically, were a biological reality of life in enclosed spaces with animals, shared sleeping arrangements, and limited means of eradication. The comb was as much an instrument of parasite management as of grooming. This was not a condition unique to the poor. It moved freely across the lines of social distinction. Clothing was worn continuously. In the cold months, the layered woolen garments that kept a body alive were not removed at night. They were slept in, worked in, eaten in, mourned in. Wool, paradoxically, has properties that resist the worst effects of sustained wear. It manages moisture, retains warmth, even damp. But it could not be washed frequently without degrading, and the dyes used to color higher status garments were often fixed with substances, urine among them, that added their own complex notes to the sensory environment of the household. The chief's mistress lived inside all of this. Her elevated position within the household meant she might have access to slightly better material conditions than an ordinary woman of the settlement. Finer cloth, more reliable food, sleeping arrangements closer to the fire's warmth, occasional access to imported goods that arrived through the chief's network of trade and tribute. But these were marginal improvements within a baseline that was, by any later standard of measurement, profoundly harsh. What her position actually gave her was not comfort. It was proximity to power. And proximity to power in the Highland world was a currency more valuable than comfort. She heard things. She was present in the spaces where decisions were made, or at least present in the household that radiated from those decisions outward into daily life. A chief returning from a council meeting, from a border dispute, from a negotiation with a neighboring family, carried that information back into his most private domestic space. The woman who shared that space received it, not always directly, not always consciously, but the accumulation of overheard conversations, of observed moods, of patterns noticed across years of proximity, built in her a form of political knowledge that had real value. This knowledge could not be owned in the way that cattle or land could be owned. It could not be inherited or transferred formally, but it could be used. It could be traded in small, careful ways. A word to a kinsman about the chief's intentions. A warning about a coming decision that would affect a family's land tenure. An insight offered at the right moment to the right person. In a world where information traveled entirely by word of mouth, and where knowing something before your neighbor knew it could mean the difference between preparation and catastrophe, her position near the chief's ear was a form of wealth. But there was a problem. Her wealth was entirely contingent on his continued attention. And attention, in a world where a chief's social obligations pulled him constantly toward alliance-making, toward the performance of status, toward the network of reciprocal obligation that kept his authority intact. That attention was not guaranteed. The legitimate wife held her position through law, through the alliance her family represented, through the formal recognition of her children's inheritance rights. The mistress held hers through something far more fragile: his interest, her usefulness, the particular quality of her presence in his life, and the ongoing willingness of both their families to maintain the arrangement. When those things shifted, and in a world of constant political realignment, they inevitably did, her position shifted with them. What happened to a chief's mistress when the arrangement ended is one of the most revealing questions you can ask about how Highland society managed the people it had used and then set aside. The answer is not simple. It was not uniformly cruel, but it was governed entirely by the same logic that had created her situation in the first place. She returned to her kin. Or she did not. The children were the hinge on which everything turned. In the Gaelic legal tradition that governed Highland social organization, the children of a chief's mistress were not automatically erased. They were not the illegitimate shadows that later Christian legal frameworks would make of them. They existed in a more complicated position, recognized within the kinship structure, carrying the blood of the chief in a world where blood was the primary currency of identity, but ranked below the children of the legitimate wife in the hierarchy of inheritance and succession. This distinction sounds clean on paper. In practice, it was anything but. A chief who had sons by his mistress and sons by his wife had introduced a structural fault line into the future of his clan. The Gaelic system of succession, tanistry, the practice by which the most capable male of the chiefly lineage was selected to lead rather than simply the eldest son, meant that the chief's illegitimate sons were not automatically excluded from consideration. They were in the pool. Their blood qualified them. Their position within the clan, their relationships with powerful kinsmen, their demonstrated capacity for leadership, all of these could, under the right circumstances, elevate them above their half-brothers born to the legitimate wife. Every chief's mistress who bore a son understood this, and every legitimate wife understood it too. The household was never simply a domestic space. It was a political arena in miniature, and the women within it, the wife with her alliance and her formal rights, the mistress with her proximity and her children, were participants in a contest that would outlast both of them. The weapons available to each were limited by the material and cultural conditions of the world they inhabited. There were no courts to appeal to, no written contracts to produce, no neutral authority to arbitrate the competing claims. There was the chief's will, the pressure of kin networks, the weight of precedent, and the slow accumulation of social obligation that determined whose children would be positioned most favorably when succession became a live question. Picture the interior of the chief's hall on a winter evening when this tension was at its most concentrated. The fire in the center of the long room throwing uneven light across the faces of the people arranged around it in their careful social geography. The chief's wife at the position of recognized honor, her children nearby, her status encoded in every aspect of how she was served and acknowledged. The mistress somewhere in that same space, not excluded, not hidden, but occupying a position whose exact coordinates shifted constantly with the political weather of the household. The smoke from that fire never fully escaped. It filled the upper half of the room and settled into every fabric, every skin, every strand of hair present. The smell of wood smoke was not background in that world. It was the medium through which all social life moved. Every conversation, every negotiation, every moment of tenderness or resentment happened inside that smell, inside that dim, warm, dangerous intimacy. What the mistress navigated in that space was not simply the chief's affection. It was the entire network of eyes watching her, the household servants whose loyalty could be purchased or withdrawn, the visiting kinsmen who reported back to their families about conditions in the chief's hall, the druids, or later the priests, whose ritual authority gave them the power to legitimate or delegitimate social arrangements, the chief's own mother, if she still lived, whose influence over her son's decisions often persisted far longer than anyone outside the household fully understood. The spiritual dimension of her position deserves particular attention, because in Highland Scotland, the boundary between the practical and the sacred was not a boundary at all. It was a permeable membrane through which meaning and causation flowed constantly in both directions. The world these people inhabited was alive in a way that modern language struggles to accurately represent. Not metaphorically alive. Actually, functionally, operationally alive. Populated by presences, by forces, by the accumulated weight of ancestors who had not fully departed, by seasonal energies that demanded acknowledgement and propitiation, by the particular power that attached to certain landscapes, certain water sources, certain trees and stones and transitional spaces where the ordinary world thinned and something else pressed through. A chief's mistress who bore healthy children was not simply lucky in the biological sense. She was understood to be in right relationship with these forces. Her fertility was evidence of spiritual alignment. The health of her children reflected something about the integrity of the arrangement, about whether the powers that governed life and reproduction had accepted what was happening in that household. Conversely, a mistress who suffered miscarriages, who lost children to the brutal mortality rates of early childhood in that world, who failed to produce surviving sons, her failure was not purely personal. It was read as a sign, as evidence that the arrangement was not favored, that some obligation had gone unmet, that the spiritual accounting of the household was out of balance. This interpretation was available to anyone who wished to use it. The legitimate wife, the chief's advisors, rival kinsmen looking for grounds to undermine a mistress whose children threatened their own position in the succession. All of them could reach for the spiritual framework to give their political interests the authority of cosmic confirmation. The women who understood this best were the ones who survived longest in the role. Survival in this context did not mean physical survival, though the physical risks were real. Childbirth in that world was a genuine encounter with death, and a woman who bore multiple children for a chief had crossed that threshold multiple times without the benefit of any medical infrastructure that could reliably bring her through it. Survival meant maintaining relevance, maintaining the web of relationships that gave her position its practical substance. She cultivated relationships with the chief's household staff, not as an act of manipulation in the modern psychological sense, but as the basic social maintenance that everyone in that world understood was necessary for functioning within any human group. She paid attention to the rhythms of obligation and reciprocity that structured daily life in the settlement, and made sure she was positioned correctly within them. She remembered things. The Gaelic world ran on oral memory. The genealogies, the legal precedents, the histories of alliance and conflict between families, all of it lived in human minds, transmitted through recitation and song and the careful repetition of elders to younger listeners. A woman with a good memory, with the ability to hold complex social information and deploy it at useful moments, was a woman with a form of power that required no physical force and left no traceable residue. And yet the system had a cost that no amount of skill or intelligence could fully insulate her from. The cost was structural. It was built into the arrangement from the beginning. And it expressed itself most clearly not in moments of dramatic conflict, but in the slow, grinding reality of what her position meant when the chief aged, when his attention moved, when the political calculations that had made her useful began to point in different directions. The chief grew old, or he died young. In that world, both outcomes arrived with equal indifference to what anyone had planned. When the succession opened, when the question of who would lead the clan moved from abstract future concern to immediate present emergency, everything that the mistress had built across years of careful proximity was tested against a single brutal question. Whose children would the clan accept, and whose would it set aside? The answer was never predetermined. That is the part of this story that resists the clean narrative arc that later centuries preferred to impose on it. There was no automatic mechanism that sorted the chief's sons into legitimate and illegitimate columns and processed them accordingly. There was the Tannist system, yes, the selection of the most capable male of the lineage. But capable was a judgment made by living people with their own interests, their own alliances, their own calculations about which outcome served them best. A mistress's son who had been raised well within the clan's social fabric, who had formed the right relationships with the right kinsmen, who had demonstrated the qualities that the Highland world recognized as leadership: physical courage, generosity, the ability to speak well in council, the capacity to inspire loyalty. That son was a genuine contender. His mother's status had not disqualified him. It had simply made the path narrower, the obstacles more numerous, the margin for error smaller. Everything she had done across the years of her position had been, in some sense, preparation for this moment. The relationships she had cultivated, the information she had gathered and carefully deployed, the spiritual credibility she had maintained, the alliances she had quietly built between her own kin and the chief's most influential supporters, all of it converged here. In the weeks and months after the chief's death, when the clan's future was being negotiated in conversations she could no longer directly influence, because she was no longer at the center of the household. She had moved to the periphery. That was the logic of succession. The new chief, whoever he turned out to be, brought his own domestic arrangements, his own wife or wives, his own network of obligation. The previous chief's mistress became a figure from the concluded chapter, her relevance dependent entirely on whether her son had succeeded to power or been set aside. If her son became chief, her position transformed completely. She became the chief's mother, a role that in Highland society carried genuine authority, genuine social weight, genuine capacity to influence decisions through the most intimate possible channel. The chief's mother was not a figure of pathos. She was a political actor of the First Order, and the Highland world knew it and factored it into every calculation that touched her son's household. But if her son did not succeed, if the selection went to the legitimate wife's son, or to a cousin whose kinsman had organized more effectively, or to a rival branch of the family whose claim the clan found more compelling, then she was what the arrangement had always, structurally, threatened to make her: a woman whose value had been entirely contingent on a man's authority, and who now existed in the aftermath of that authority without any of the formal protections that would have attached to a legitimate wife's position. She returned to her kin, if her kin would have her. If the family that had originally negotiated her into the chief's household still had the standing and the willingness to absorb her back into its structure. If the years she had spent in proximity to power had not so thoroughly separated her from the daily rhythms of ordinary clan life, that reintegration was possible. Sometimes it worked. The Gaelic world was not a world of permanent shame in the way that later Christian societies would construct around sexual and domestic arrangements that fell outside the approved model. A woman who had served as a chief's companion, who had borne his children, who had maintained herself with dignity and skill within a role that everyone understood. That woman was not automatically marked as ruined. She had performed a recognized social function. Her kin could, and often did, welcome her back without the kind of catastrophic social judgment that later centuries would have attached to her history. But welcome back to what? That is the question that cuts to the heart of what her life had actually been. She had spent her most capable years at the center of a world that operated at a scale and intensity far beyond what ordinary clan life offered. She had been present for decisions that shaped the fate of families, territories, alliances. She had accumulated knowledge, relationships, and a form of social fluency that had no obvious application in a household organized around the grinding daily work of agricultural survival. The return was not simply a geographical movement. It was a reduction, a compression of the world back down to the dimensions that most people in that landscape inhabited without ever having known anything larger. Some women managed this transition with the same skill they had brought to every other challenge the role had presented. They became repositories of knowledge about the chief's household, about the inner workings of clan politics, about the histories and weaknesses of the families their kin needed to navigate. They became advisors in the informal sense, consulted not because anyone had granted them authority, but because they knew things that nobody else knew, and knowledge in that world was never wasted. Others did not manage the transition. Their stories dissolved into the landscape the way that most lives in that world dissolved, without record, without monument, without the genealogical preservation that attached to the children of legitimate unions and the descendants of recognized bloodlines. What remains is not their names, it is the structure that produced them. And that structure, the mechanism by which Highland society simultaneously needed these women, used them, and provided them with no durable protection against the consequences of that use, is not a curiosity of ancient Scotland. It is a recognizable pattern. It appears in every society that has ever organized itself around the concentration of power in a small number of hands, and then needed to manage the human relationships that concentration generated without fully acknowledging the cost those relationships imposed on the people at their edges. The clan chiefs of ancient Scotland were not uniquely cruel. They were not uniquely calculating. They were operating within a system that had evolved over generations to solve specific problems. How to maintain authority, how to build alliances, how to manage succession in a world without stable institutions. And the women at the edges of their households were one of the system's solutions. Functional, necessary, largely invisible in the records that survived, but not invisible in the reality of how that world actually worked. Every alliance that held, every succession that proceeded without the clan fracturing, every generation of children who carried their father's blood into the future of the Highland kinship network. Behind each of these outcomes, somewhere in the smoke and cold and intimate darkness of the chief's hall, a woman had been doing the invisible work that made the visible order possible. The Highland world did not commemorate her. It did not need to. It simply required her, used what she offered, and moved forward. The way systems always move forward, indifferent to the individual costs of their own functioning, focused entirely on their own survival. Which is, perhaps, the most Highland thing about her story.